Hello everyone, and welcome to Translationborne, where we talk about translation, Bloodborne, and the translation of Bloodborne, beginning this time with Gehrman's Nightmare.
Oh, Lawrence, Master Willem, somebody help me. Unshackle me, please. Anybody. I've had enough of this dream. The night blocks all sight. Oh, somebody, please.
Yep, sounds like a nightmare alright, though strictly in the conventional sense of the word, rather than the metaphysical sort of dream realm we were discussing at the end of the last episode. Not that this doesn't get brought up in what Gehrman actually says, because in the line that's officially been translated as, "I've had enough of this dream," the Japanese term in question is Yume, which literally translates to dream rather than akumu, which would be nightmare. So if Gehrman can be understood as referring to the hunter's dream, and I think that makes sense, this would be an instance where it's being referenced the same way both in the English and in the Japanese. Given what I mentioned in the last episode about the hunter's dream occasionally being called a nightmare, I thought that was worth pointing out. But while we're on the subject of this line, I wanted to bring up how well I think it works despite a number of grammatical changes. For one thing, as you may have noticed, my more literal version of this line has Gehrman begin both short sentences with himself as the subject. The Japanese makes this clear in the first sentence because it starts with watashi wa, which is the word for I followed by a particle that in this case is being used to highlight it as the subject. For example, watashi wa shinda would be one way of saying I died. To get back to the point though, while the first sentence in this line clearly identifies the word I as its subject, the second sentence is a little less straightforward. Technically, it lacks a subject entirely, but typically in Japanese this would mean that the implied actor is I, just like before. This is why my more literal version has the second half of this line as, I can't see anything in this night anymore. Despite these grammatical differences though, I think the official English works well as a translation, and I say this for two reasons. First, for all that the phrasing is different, I think the underlying meaning remains unchanged. One way or another, Gehrman is complaining of how long this night has gone on, and noting that at this late stage he's lost his vision. But I would also argue that the phrasing used in the official English has an advantage over a more straightforward rendering here, because I think it does a better job of conveying Gehrman's state of mind. He feels trapped, sick of the dream that binds him as everything grows dim in the course of what must seem to him like one interminable night. Not only that, the night blocks all sight just sounds like the sort of thing you'd catch someone saying in their sleep, which is the context for this dialogue. Considering all this, I think both the shift in subject and the other grammatical changes work better than a more literal rendering. But there was more than one line in that dialogue we got from Gehrman, and there's one more point I wanted to bring up about how he both does and does not use honorifics in the first thing he says. Before we get too far into that though, you may be wondering what I mean by honorifics. These are a common feature of the Japanese language that don't really have a direct equivalent in English. They're kind of like suffixes that get attached to different people's names or titles when other people refer to them, and they help contextualize the relationship between people. If you want to come across as politely respectful to someone you don't know, for instance, you may refer to them using their last name followed by the honorific san. This often is translated by using the appellation Mr. or Mrs. in English, so Tanaka-san would translate reasonably well to Mr. Tanaka. Also, as we've seen in the game, these sorts of honorifics can be attached to certain job titles or positions if you don't know someone's name. The young girl who gave us the music box, for instance, refers to us in Japanese as Kemonogari-san, and in the English this is translated as either Mr. Hunter or Miss Hunter, depending on whether the player's character is male or female. However, as I've mentioned before, the important thing here is not really finding an equivalent term of address so much as properly conveying the relationship between one character and another. So when the chapel dweller calls us Karyudo-san and the translation is kind hunter, that's another effective way of getting across how he feels about us. By that point, the player character has to have sent some number of NPCs to the safety of Erden Chapel, honoring his request, so it makes perfect sense that he would refer to us in a polite manner by calling us kind. In some cases, you don't even need to use an equivalent word in reference to an honorific. You can rely on the general phrasing of a conversation to get across how one character feels about another. However you translate honorifics, though, they're a regular part of Japanese speech. If you don't use an honorific when referring to someone, it's generally taken either as a sign of rudeness or of intimacy, which is interesting because this is how Gehrman refers to Lawrence in the Japanese, by name only. When Gehrman speaks Willem's name, on the other hand, he calls him Willem-sensei, an honorific used as a term of respect with a strong implication that the speaker considers that person a teacher or mentor. Now, it's tough to say from this honorific alone whether Gehrman studied under Willem himself, but it does indicate that he personally knew Willem and at least respected his position. My inclination would be to say that this implies that Gehrman considered Lawrence a close friend and both knew and thought highly of Willem. Ultimately, I think this is all in line with the official English, especially with the ambiguity of how personal the master in Master Willem is, but seeing the Japanese really drove this home for me, and I thought that was worth sharing. Anyway, let's move on. Messenger's white ribbon. A white ribbon the messengers wear for some reason. That, with its accompanying beautiful luster and delicate lace, would, after all, likely be best suited to a charming young girl. As you can see, there are a number of differences here from the strictly literal, though for the most part I think this is to the official translation's credit. Certainly the sentence structure I used in my more literal version is noticeably more awkward, so I'm glad to see the official version rearrange it to be more natural. But even accounting for that, there are a few points where the translation seems to differ in some of the details. Probably the most noticeable of these is how the official English compares the look of the ribbon on the messengers to the look of the ribbon on a young girl. In the Japanese, on the other hand, the messengers aren't mentioned here at all. However, I do think bringing the messengers up again serves some interesting functions, because it naturally incorporates some grammatical elements of the Japanese that add up to sort of imply the same thing. First, there's our old friend Yahari, which I've translated as after all, and that generally is used to mean that one's expectation has been met. This is where there's arguably the first hint of a comparison being made, because one of the nuances of Yahari is that despite having a number of options to choose from, the standard option is what ultimately gets chosen. So this could be interpreted as saying despite how the ribbon looks on the messengers, it's really best suited for young girls, as you might expect. Which brings me to the other interesting grammatical point here, because the reason I keep using the phrase best suited in English is due to the word koso in the Japanese. This is most commonly used as an intensifier. You might think of it like the for sure in the sentence, I'm going to do it this time for sure. As it's used in reference to the white messenger ribbon, it's emphasizing that it is specifically young girls that the ribbon looks good on. Taken together, I think adding in an explicit comparison and saying the ribbon is better suited to charming young girls, as opposed to messengers, works as a way of both drawing out the implicit comparison in the Japanese and conveying how this is just the result one would expect. I especially like the phrasing of silly old messengers here, because it not only makes the reader think that of course the ribbon wouldn't look good on them, but it also emphasizes their naive and childish nature, which is a consistent part of how they're framed. But there's another, less character-driven part of this description that I think is interesting. You may have noticed that in describing the ribbon, my more literal version refers to its accompanying beautiful luster and delicate lace, while the official version says that it's a ribbon made of fine lace. That's because the Japanese verb used to describe the lace is tomonao, which generally means to accompany or to go along with, though it can also be used to describe the accompanying qualities of something. For instance, an example sentence from my Daijisen Japanese dictionary is Kiken ga tomonau fuyuyama, which I might translate as a wintry peak fraught with peril, to get across the idea that literally the mountain is accompanied by danger. By this understanding, I can see how the two descriptors for the white messenger ribbon, first that it shines and second that its lace is delicate, might be combined into the sentence, a ribbon made of fine lace that shines remarkably. But I think a close look at the image for this item reveals another possibility, because there's a bit of decorative lace that extends down from the ribbon itself. In other words, it's possible that the Japanese is first indicating that the ribbon itself shines beautifully, and second that it has some delicate lace that goes along with it. Which I bring up not to say that the official translation is off, as I mentioned, I think that grammatical interpretation is valid, but as another potential piece of evidence that the team didn't have access to visuals. So now let's talk dialogue.
Good hunter, your presence somehow soothes. I sense the ancient echoes. They course your veins.
Okay, this is a short set of lines with a lot going on in a way that looking at a literal take on the translation doesn't really capture. So let's start by getting a better idea of the meaning of the Japanese. The key word in the first line here is懐かしさ, which is a nominalized form of the adjective 懐かしい. This is a word that can be tricky to translate, and a lot of the time it's associated in English with the concept of nostalgia. To give a loose example, if in conversation someone brings up something you remember fondly from your youth, but that you haven't thought of in a long time, in English you might say something like, "Wow, that takes me back," whereas a Japanese speaker may remark, "Ah, natsukashi." However, this is not the only situation in which the term natsukashi is used. The primary sense of the word in my Daijisen Japanese dictionary is actually the feeling of having one's heart drawn to something such that one longs to be near that thing. It's the second sense of the word that's closer to the one I gave before, where one feels transported back to a pleasant time in the past by thinking of someone or something. It also has a third sense of finding someone so dear that the speaker feels compelled to draw them close, and a fourth sense related to clothing that one finds comfortable and familiar. The common through line here is a feeling of being drawn to something, often due to some amount of familiarity and fondness. So to get back to the doll's line, she's basically saying that she gets this feeling from us. But how do you convey that exactly? Well, in my more literal version, I've gone with familiar warmth to try and get at the idea of an attractive and inviting quality that's tinged with reminiscence. Though I imagine without the full context of the explanation I just gave, some of that wouldn't come through and it would just be confusing. Contrast this with the official version of "your presence somehow soothes." Here, the emphasis is more on the comforting aspect of natsukashi, but it has the benefit of building in the idea of an attraction, since we're naturally drawn to things we find soothing. Also, this phrasing makes it clear that this is a feeling that's emanating from the player character, rather than being caused by an inherent quality or the result of our social interactions. Something about our presence has changed. It's a natural-sounding translation that concisely preserves a good amount of the original meaning, even if it does arguably lose some of the nuance of referring to the past that's in the Japanese. Which brings us to the next line, because this is where some of the nuance referring to the past comes back, though possibly at the cost of other aspects of the original. But let's start by looking again at the meaning of this line in Japanese. This time, one of the key words to focus on is related to something we've looked at before, because when the doll is musing on how hunters must truly inherit wills of the past, the word she uses for wills is ishi, which sounds exactly like the game-specific term ishi that could be understood as dying wills of blood and is officially translated as blood echoes. So while literally she's talking about how the feeling of fond familiarity she gets from us must be a tangible expression of the desires we've inherited from those who've gone before, there's a sense in which we can understand that these desires are what we've drawn from the blood of the dead. In other words, us being filled with blood echoes has altered our presence such that, to the doll at least, we give off an air much like those who came before. Which is to say that what the doll is really doing is sensing the echoes that course our veins, as these, of course, are born by blood. Following this interpretation, I think you can see where the official translation may have been coming from, and the idea that the doll is soothed by the echoes of the past now present in us still comes through. Having said that, though, I do think the idea that hunters inherit the will of those who came before is weaker in the official English than it is in the Japanese. Honestly, I think this is an aspect of the game as a whole that's a lot clearer in the Japanese text as opposed to the English. You can still find these themes in the translation if you look for them, but they're a lot harder to miss in the Japanese. I think a big part of this comes down to the challenge of working with terms like chi-no-ishi and shiketsu to begin with, since in Japanese these names make it much more obvious that the will of the deceased lingers in death blood, and that our character as a hunter inherits or channels that will to become stronger. Meanwhile, even if I think terms like blood echoes and cold blood work well at capturing some of these ideas within the practical limitations of the game, they can make it harder to pick up on certain connections. For instance, the Japanese for the old hunter bone is able to rely on a parallel between hunters inheriting the wills of the dead from blood and reviving a lost technique from a bone. The official English, on the other hand, has to refer to hunters as carriers of the torch to get at the idea that they keep the will of those who've gone before alive, which feels more like new information than a reference to what they do with blood echoes. And perhaps these lines from the doll would feel similarly disconnected if the second line wasn't so clear. But before I sum up my thoughts on this, let's turn to a more straightforward case. While we were in Byrgenwerth, we picked up an alternative version of the student uniform, and there's just one line that's different from the uniform we looked at before. It reads, "This one has a thick cape attached." Contrast that with, "The thick cape has been removed from this one." Again, these are both straightforward translations, but I did want to note that I like how in both languages there are subtle clues that the version with the cape is the original. In the Japanese, this is done by saying the cape was removed, while in the English, the one without a cape is actually called an alternative. But to get back to the examination of the doll's dialogue, I wanted to finish my thoughts on this by stepping back and looking at the effect of these two lines as a whole. Starting with the Japanese then, we first get the idea that the doll can now sense an air of fond familiarity about the hunter. Then we listen as she muses on how it's the nature of hunters to inherit past wills, implying that blood echoes are the reason the hunter now feels this way to her. In the official English, the doll notes that the hunter has a soothing air about them, then explains that she can sense the ancient echoes that run through the hunter's veins, implying that it's because of the blood echoes that the hunter now feels this way to her. So yes, the nuance of the inheritance of dying wills isn't as strong, but considering that these are only two short lines, and the translation of a game-specific term like blood echoes is locked in, I think this solution works pretty well. And that's the thought I'll be going out on. If you have any feedback on this issue or anything else, please let me know. And until next time, thanks for watching everyone.